Hello again, students. This week we are going to be talking about Andrew Jackson. And as we talk about President number 7 this week, I want you to really think about was this, were the actions that Andrew Jackson took, were they presidential qualities, things that we would want a president to do, or were they rough, not so presidential qualities? So if you take a second here, pause the video after I give this description, just think about what are some qualities, some characteristics that we would want to see in a president. So pause the video right now and think about that for a couple of minutes. Okay, so hopefully you've thought about what kind of characteristics that you think a president should have, and some of the things that might have come to your mind might be strong leader or honest, um, someone who is not afraid, someone who is very smart and can make tough decisions that are in the best interest of the United States. And so these are all things that we think about when we think about a a president and what presidential qualities look like. So as we talk about Andrew Jackson today and this week, I want you to think about whether or not you think Andrew Jackson was presidential, or whether he was, more of a rough character and not so presidential in some of the actions that we're going to talk about. So let's start with before Jackson even becomes president. And this was in the lesson from last week about the Monroe Doctrine. But just as a quick review, James Monroe was president number 5, and he was president of the United States, and he ordered Andrew Jackson, as who was recently a hero in the War of 1812, especially at the Battle of New Orleans. He asked in 1816 Andrew Jackson to go to Florida to settle a dispute between the United States residents living in Georgia and these Native Americans and the Spanish residents living in Florida, because at the time Florida was controlled by Spain. Well, when Andrew Jackson got there, instead of just settling the border dispute that he was sent there to do, he basically decided he was going to invade Spanish Florida. He wanted to visit Disney World, and so he just invaded Spanish Florida. He kicks out the Spanish governor, puts him on a boat, sends him back to Spain, and he heads for, and he headed, the Spanish governor headed back to Spain, and the United States ends up gaining Florida out of this deal. Spain had the choice whether they wanted to start a war over this, and ultimately they decided to sell the United States Spain for $5 million and a promise that we would never settle in what is today Texas. And of course, as you know, we would end up going to Texas later. So the positives of this are that the United States gained land in what is today Florida. The negative is that this could have started a war with Spain. So I want you to ask yourself, was this a presidential thing that Andrew Jackson did, or was this a rough, not so presidential quality that Andrew Jackson did in Florida, even though it was technically before he became president? So as we move on here, let's talk about something called Jacksonian Democracy. You can see the quote there from Andrew Jackson. It says, "Any man worth his salt will stick up for what he believes is right, but it takes a slightly better man to acknowledge instantly without reservation that he is in error." And interesting that Andrew Jackson would say this quote, since acknowledging that he was wrong was something that he really struggled with. But Jacksonian democracy, this vocab term, basically refers to this period of time before Andrew Jackson became president and afterwards, where more democratic ideas or more power was given to the people. So you see the definition there, a period from the 1820s and 1830s where democracy expanded. Nominating conventions came out of that. That was where you had, instead of just a couple of plugged in rich members of a political party deciding who the next president would be, it was now up to anybody who was registered as a Democrat or a Republican or whatever political party you might have been a part of, or a Whig, which was another political party. Now all of a sudden, people could vote that did not own land. Remember, before this, the only people that could vote were white male property owners. And so now they expanded it to where as long as you are a white male, you could vote. Now, this still didn't change the fact that women were not allowed to vote. It still did not change the fact that African Americans and Native Americans were not allowed to vote. But it was trending in the correct direction. Okay, through this, the Democratic Party was formed, and they were people that were on Andrew Jackson's side. And then Jackson picked a guy from South Carolina named John C. Calhoun to be his running mate for president when he ran for president in 1824. And when he ran for president in 1824, Jackson won the popular vote. That means the most people voted for Jackson, um, and but Jackson didn't become president. And that was a big problem. The reason why Jackson didn't become president is because a guy named Henry Clay made a secret deal so that John Quincy Adams could become president. Andrew Jackson is not made president in 1824, and for the rest of his life, he harbors bitter resentment against Henry Clay. And on Tuesday, next week, in our live class, I will talk a little bit about the story behind Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. So 4 years go by. Andrew Jackson is really, really ticked off and really mad that John Quincy Adams becomes president by this kind of secret deal that Henry Clay makes. In 1828, Jackson runs again, and this time he defeats Henry Clay. And during that campaign, people described John Quincy Adams as cold as a lump of ice, and people described Jackson as hot-tempered, crude, and ill-equipped. There was a lot of name-calling going back and forth between the two parties, and Jackson ultimately does win the election in 1828, and John Quincy Adams is not reelected. So when Andrew Jackson comes in as president, the first thing that happens on the day he's inaugurated, he throws a big party on the White House lawn. And this is a primary source quote from a woman who was there, Margaret Baird Smith. She said, "What a scene we witnessed. A rabble, a mob of boys, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping, cut glass and china to the amount of several $1,000s was broken. But it was the people's day and the people's president and the people would rule." You see, Andrew Jackson was very popular amongst the common people because he was down to earth and plain spoken, and they did not interpret Jackson as some rich guy in Washington, D.C. that was not going to listen to what their needs were. All right, so once Jackson becomes president, a couple things happen, and for both of these things, I want you to once again think about, are these things presidential, or are they rough, not-so-presidential qualities about Andrew Jackson? The first one is called the spoils system. And with the spoils system, basically what happened was when Jackson got in to be president, he fired every single federal government worker that was associated with John Quincy Adams. He fired all of them, and in their place he appointed people who were his friends or who had contributed to his campaign to help him get elected. And so my question to you is this presidential or is this not presidential? And I want you to think about that for a second. The argument to say that it was presidential would be that, if those people were left in their positions, they probably, because they were John Quincy Adams people, probably would not help Andrew Jackson to be able to run the government in a positive way. That's the argument for this as being presidential. The argument against it is it really the right thing to do to just fire everybody because they don't agree with you? Is it the best way to run a government or be a leader if you always surround people surround yourself with people who will just always say yes sir or yes ma'am and just do everything that you say and never question you or give you other opinions? And so those are kind of the two arguments for and against the spoils system. The second thing that Jackson did as president was he came up with something that later became known as the kitchen cabinet. He had his official advisors that gave him information every day, but he also met with some lawyers and some newspaper writers secretly in the White House kitchen. Literally, they would come in the back door of the White House at night, and maybe they shared some oyster ice cream or some other thing like that, and they just talked about what was going on, and Jackson asked them for advice on what should be done with running the country. So that group became known as his kitchen cabinet. So take a second and think about, was that a presidential thing for Jackson to do to get more input from other people, or was that a rough, not so presidential thing to do? During Jackson's presidency, the United States economy was basically divided into three regions. And this is kind of a basis of what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks when we start talking about the Industrial Revolution. And so the northern economy that you see in purple in this picture was made up of all mostly manufacturing. So you had factories, manufacturing and making things. The South was made up of agriculture. lots and lots of farming, and of course, because of that agricultural farming economy, the South relied on slavery, which we'll talk about more as the year goes on. The North did not rely on slavery near as much because of their factories and their warehouses. In the West, this new emerging area was basically controlled by land. It was nothing but land in the West. That was available. People wanted to buy land, they wanted to sell it at a profit, they wanted to buy land and develop it. The invention of the railroad was coming, and people wanted to lay railroad track across the West, and so land was the driving factor for the economy in the West. So Jackson's presidency is defined by a couple of things. We mentioned already the spoils system, and we also mentioned the spoils system and the kitchen cabinet. Two other things happened during his party, or three other things really happened during his party. Number one is the nullification crisis. The nullification crisis, basically what happens is there was a tax on imported goods. A tariff was the vocab word for that, and it affected the South disproportionately from the North, because the South relied on a lot of imported goods from England and Spain and France, and this tariff hurt the South disproportionately. And so South Carolina, and really I think we're going to call South Carolina kind of the drama queen of the states at this point in time, and we'll talk about them a little bit later in the year as a drama queen again. But South Carolina decided that they were going to refuse to pay this tariff. They were not going to pay the tax. In fact, they threatened to leave the Union if they needed to. And so basically what happens is Andrew Jackson says we can't let them leave the Union. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send my vice president, John C. Calhoun, who was from South Carolina, down there to get them straightened out. So John C. Calhoun goes down to South Carolina, and he basically says, okay, I'm going to take care of this. And when he tells the people of South Carolina, hey, you need to start paying this tax, they say, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, not only are we not going to do that, but if the government tries to make us do this, we are going to secede from the Union. We're going to leave the Union. So when Andrew Jackson gets this letter from John C. Calhoun, he is furious. And he says, I sent my vice president down there to take care of this. He didn't take care of it, and now I am mad. And he is so mad that he basically tells John C. Calhoun, he says to one of his advisors, if South Carolina secedes from the Union, I will secede John C. Calhoun's head from his shoulders. So think about that a second. The word secede means to separate from. Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, said that if his vice president, John C. Calhoun, could not get South Carolina to go back on their threat to secede, he was threatening to decapitate his own vice president. That's how angry Andrew Jackson was. And it seems like he was pretty serious about the threat. So, again, John C. Calhoun, at this point, once his life is threatened by the president, basically decides that he's going to, keep his distance from President Jackson, but he still stays on the side of the South Carolinians, saying they shouldn't have to pay the tariff. Two other things happen while Jackson is president. You can see that Andrew Jackson basically got rid of the national bank. So the federal bank had been created right after the founding of our country, and the contract for it was up in 1836, and Jackson did not believe in the federal bank, and so he shut it down. And when he did shut it down, it led to a depression in the Panic of 1837, which created some economic troubles for people in the United States. And then finally, there was another political party formed basically in response to Jackson. These people really thought that Jackson was ruining the country, and they wanted to have somebody come along that could defeat him and go back on some of the things that he did, and they were called the Whig Party. They said that he acted like he was a king, and that he was wearing like one of those white powdered wigs that they wore in Britain, and that's why they called themselves the Whig Party. And you can see here in the picture that, they said, Whigs to the rescue, they couldn't possibly be worse, as if they couldn't be worse than Andrew Jackson. So, that's a basic summary of Andrew Jackson's presidency. There is one other topic, which is his treatment of Native Americans, that we're going to address next week. But for now, that's it for Andrew Jackson. So check out the directions in your assignment after you finish watching the video, and let me know if you have any questions.